Okay, welcome everybody to another Earth2Class program. We're very pleased today to be joined by our friend Ajit, who has given several previous talks and has been a nice supporter of Earth2Class at other places. So without further ado, I will make Ajit the co-host. And Ajit, you can begin your sharing.
I can just fill it out.
And hopefully you see it now in the full screen mode.
Yes.
Yep.
We have it. Thank you.
Okay. So today I thought I'll talk a little bit about a project that we're doing in remote community in Northwest Alaska called Kotzebue. The coast, so there's a map that's coming up. So you can see it here, but there's a map coming up. Basically, if you hang a hard right after you pass through the Bering Straits, you'll fall into Kotzebue Sound. And Kotzebue is a village that's in the tip of peninsula called the Hotham Peninsula. The only way you can get there is by boat or by air. The boat is available only in the summertime because the whole area ices up. So in the winter, like about now, the only way to get in there is by airplane. Although it's changing, and we have to see how this is going to work over the next many years. I don't know if we can do this fully interactive where I can ask questions of you, but I'm going to give it a shot. And just see if any of you recognize what it is we're looking at here. I mean, there's a text, but given that there's a very unusual way of looking at the Earth, I don't know if it makes sense for everybody as in terms of what you're seeing.
Is that the North Pole?
Yep, the crosshair that you see here is the North Pole. And this is a polar view of the Earth. It's in a polar stereographic projection. And what we're seeing here is essentially the area that's covered by ice. And you can see that there is some parts that in November is exactly 2 years ago, are completely covered in ice, but then there are other parts that are not. This whole thing used to be covered by ice in the past, and slowly the amount of ice cover that we have in the Arctic has been going down. So you can see this, for example, or this particular series of images where what it looked like in 1980 and basically where we are 10 years ago, and then it has been going down even further since. There are intraannual variations, and so if you look at it as a time series, either for sometime in the middle of spring, winter, I guess, or end of winter, end of summer, you can see that there are changes between years, but on the whole, we are losing ice in the Arctic at a fairly rapid rate. In fact, the Arctic is one of the fastest warming places on this planet. So what does it mean for us? Again, just to throw a question out there, if anyone wants to take a shot at the word phenology, does that make sense to anybody out there? When you hear the phenology of things, do you know, anyone have a sense of what it is that they're talking about? It basically has to do with timing in terms of, the sort of the terrestrial phenology that folks are often familiar with is when fall leaves start turning color, or when springtime leaves come in, or when particular flowers bloom. And there are big projects, for example, in England, where they keep track. It's a citizen science project where they keep track of these kinds of phenological data to look at change over time. The change in Arctic sea ice also has a phenology, and changes to the phenology has very profound effects in terms of how the system works. So if you look at it in this particular figure, you're going from January on the left to December on the right. And so as the winter basically comes to an end and spring comes in, it's dark. Right now, you're looking at up to something like 18, 19 hours of darkness, and it's reducing really rapidly. But then in the spring, when the sun comes out, you start seeing the snow and ice to thin until the ice is thin enough that there is light that passes through the ice, and you can start getting photosynthetic organisms that grow on the underside of the ice or in the ice. These are the ice algae. And then these ice algae are an extremely important part of the food web in the Arctic. They grow on the ice and then they fall on the seafloor, feeding all the benthic animals. So the clams and things like that depend on the ice algae or the carbon that comes from the ice algae that is coming from above, that is raining on them. You have the ice algae, and then at some point, the ice completely disappears, and you're basically in open water, and you have regular phytoplankton that start blooming. And this goes on till the nutrients that the phytoplankton need are run out. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions, and I please invite you to just speak up and stop me if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense or you don't fully understand. So, I'm going to make some assumptions about words like phytoplankton, single-cell plants that I don't need to explain, but I don't assume too much, so please don't hesitate to stop me if you need me to explain any of the terms I'm using. Once the water opens up, you have phytoplankton blooms, and this is essentially what drives the Arctic food web. Everything that lives there is going to depend on phytoplankton. They're the primary producers that use sunlight to produce organic matter that is then consumed by everything else. This goes on till the nutrients are depleted. And then in the fall, you might have some storms that might stir up the water and bring some more new nutrients in there. But at some point, you start getting ice algae, the ice growing in again, and some ice algae till there's no more light, and the snow and the ice get thicker. So this is sort of the annual cycle through which the photosynthetic organisms in the Arctic that form the base of the food chain operate through. The blue line here is basically showing you, is giving you some sense of both the penetration of light as well as the availability of nutrients. This is the current system. But what we anticipate is going to happen, or what is already happening because of warming, is the fact that the ice melt actually happens a lot earlier. The sun doesn't, well, to state the obvious, the sun doesn't rise any earlier. But the ice algae the ice starts disappearing earlier, which means that you have a longer growth period for the ice algae, and you also have a longer growth period for the phytoplankton. And the ice, again, in the fall grows in later. So in all, you're seeing a longer productivity time in the Arctic. And what we have actually documented using satellite data is that the Arctic has become more productive, capable of supporting a bigger food web. However, this is nothing to, as you'll pick up from the rest of my talk, there's nothing to celebrate or feel particularly thrilled about, because there are a couple of consequences to this. One is, as I had mentioned, the phytoplankton blooms happen till they run out of nutrients, and now there's a lot longer time for that to happen. What this does is that it then sets up the system for a succession of species. So you often will have diatoms that are really good for fish to eat, that bloom early in the spring or early in the summer, late in the spring. But then at some point, the diatoms go away, and now we are seeing emergence of new species of phytoplankton that didn't used to, that were never seen in the Arctic before. And while phytoplankton are the base of the food web, You should also note, just as with almost anything else in life, not all phytoplankton are good, as in there are good guys and bad guys, and some of the bad guys are toxic. There are phytoplankton where only one or two cells in the water will kill you. They certainly cause a lot of problems for the animals that live there as well. So this change in the community composition, if you will, of the phytoplankton is something that is of great concern. One of the reasons it's especially acute in the Arctic and in communities like Kotzebue is that they get up to 70% of their food from subsistence hunting. And much of that is coming from the waters around Kotzebue, be it in the form of fish, seals, or whales. And so any change to the food system there, to the food web in the water, is going to have a very profound effect on the ability of the people that live there to eat the food that is of cultural importance to them and is of nutritional importance to them. This is a concept that we call food sovereignty. So you might have heard of food security, which is essentially having enough food to eat. But food sovereignty is a notion where you actually select what you want to eat. And in this particular case, the concern is that you don't want to replace the food that they have been eating for generations to basically be replaced by extraordinarily expensive food that is probably not as nutritionally good that you buy in a supermarket. Just to remind you, again, in a place like Kotzebue, almost all the food that you get there is flown in by airplanes. So a gallon of milk will easily cost you $14. And food in general is extremely expensive because very little is available locally except for what you get from subsistence hunting, be it caribou, muskox, or seals, so on and so forth. So how the base of the food web is changing is something that is really, really important to the people that live there. And it's not just the food. It's also it's not just the food as a nutritional thing. It is also that it is culturally important to them. It essentially goes to a way of life. And so they have basically been asking some very basic questions as to how the system is changing and how it is going to, and what we can predict about how it will change in the future. And very specifically, one of the questions in a project that we worked with them on, it was a co-production of knowledge project. One of the questions they asked was, how is the length of the ugruk, which is the bearded seal hunting season, change? And what are the factors that influence the length of the hunting season? Because this is essentially how they get their food. So again, to sort of beat this point a little harder, you have phytoplankton that in general were eaten by zooplankton or by ice algae that live on the seafloor, shellfish and crustaceans. They eat the algae that falls on them. And the small fish eat the zooplankton, all of which are eaten by whales, seals, walruses. And you have the larger fish and birds that depend on this. And then eventually you have the humans that collect all of this. Now, if this did not exist, that would be the healthy ecosystem. But with the changes that have been happening in the Arctic, we are starting to now see growth of harmful algal blooms, which are toxic or of not as good food quality. So the harmful algal blooms can be harmful because they kill you tomorrow. They could be harmful because they have hepatotoxins, such as cyanobacteria, have hepatotoxins that affect your liver function. So you're not probably going to keel over and die tomorrow, but your liver function is slowly eroded such that over time you end up having worse health. And then you also have this issue where it is harmful to the ecosystem because the quality of the food is not the same or is not as good. In general, and this is again, there are always caveats and exceptions, but in general, diatoms are considered to be high quality food because they actually pack a lot of lipids. They're fatty, which is also why diatoms are prime candidates for making biodiesels. But in any case, in this case, their preferred food for fish is zooplankton because they actually carry much more nutritional value. Whereas cyanobacteria, so you can think of diatoms as the donuts out there, where cyanobacteria is something like the straw, as in, you can still eat them, but they certainly don't carry the same nutritional value as a diatom does, and therefore is not going to sustain the food web in the same way. But anyways, that's to give you a sense of what the food web looks like. Now, research done by folks at Woods Hole basically have discovered that there is occurrence of an organism called Alexandrium, which is extremely toxic. And the case that Don Anderson makes is that the amount of Alexandrium that they found in the waters of Alaska is vastly higher than the toxic species they've been working in the Gulf of Maine. And so he puts this map up usually to just show the contrast in terms of the size, the amount of area we are looking at. And on the one hand, you have, of course, a smaller population, but it's an extremely isolated population. And so, this is something where when we talk to folks in Coast Guard, they talk about, Coast Guard helicopters being needed to pick up somebody at some remote village to take them to a hospital because they do not have anything locally that they can use to save lives. And there have been a few, not very many, a few reported deaths. But this is an emerging phenomenon. That's the main thing to remember. This is something that seems to have happened in the last 10 years because harmful algal blooms in this part of Alaska have really not been reported before the changes that are now being seen right now. The concept here is that you have these are dinoflagellates, a certain kind of phytoplankton that form resting cysts during the winter. And usually those resting cysts are in the sediments. But when the waters are warming, they come up to the surface and they make big blooms, red tide blooms, which I think is the term you might have heard. And that basically then transports it's transported by ocean currents, and that's essentially what is causing these big blooms that we're now seeing in the Chukchi Sea. So this is something, like I said, that the folks out there are extremely concerned about because they depend as much as they do on the availability of food from the ocean. This is something, I want to kind of just spend a couple of seconds to talk about this whole idea of food sovereignty and food security. While this is a very serious phenomenon, it is something that we are still trying to understand, and it does not help to then have screaming headlines on the dangers posed by this, even as you're trying to educate the population that has not been exposed to these kinds of dangers before. So just as a sort of a point on the side, this is a place that is rich in indigenous knowledge, and people have been living like their fathers and forefathers before them, and they've not dealt with this idea of harmful algal blooms or not getting food at particular times in these waters. I'm saying this because if you actually go further south to waters around Sitka or somewhere in the southeast Alaskan region, there these toxic blooms have been known for a long time. And the folks that live there actually even have sort of sayings such as, you do not harvest clams when the herring come to spawn, because they have noticed over generations of observations that when the herring come to spawn, it is at a particular time of the year when the waters are warm. And that's basically when you have the greatest danger from harmful algal blooms. And therefore, you do not want to actually harvest clams at that time. So places where this has been going on for a long time, there is actually some built-in indigenous knowledge in terms of how to deal with it. However, in these waters in the Chukchi Sea, it is a new phenomenon, and therefore it is something that we really need to be a lot more concerned or wary about. So articles have been written about this, but like I said, it's not particularly helpful when folks start getting hysterical about it. So these articles are informative in some fashion. And so there've been some, shall we say, responsible reporting on this. But there are other articles that have been talking about California-sized algae creeping up into the Arctic that are a lot more alarmist. And what this does is that then it stops people from actually eating the food that may be all right. And instead spending a lot more money on buying food in grocery stores. And at some level, there's even a little bit of a question as to whether the risk of eating food that is nutritionally not good for you is worse than the risk that you might be exposed to in case there is a bloom. This is the sort of, not to pick up. Hello? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I know there was just some noise that I wasn't sure. So the one of the problems with these kinds of articles is that it's not even factually correct, because what they're showing here is a bloom of cyanobacteria while they're actually talking about dinoflagellate bloom, which at some level might be picking on nitpicking a little bit, but these are important differences because the dinoflagellate bloom will kill you. The cyanobacteria bloom might affect your liver function, and you're certainly not going to die tomorrow if you drink water that has cyanobacteria in it. So it's just one of those things where we just have to be careful about how the information that we are collecting is being disseminated. And they now have instituted a plan for communications that's based on the local health systems warnings that they put out there, where they're able to tell people in time not to harvest clams from a particular place because toxic algae have been seen there. But as you saw in the map before, this is an extraordinarily large area, and the amount of sampling that is done there, the amount of research that's done there is pretty sporadic, and therefore it's a really challenging sort of a thing to do. And we are now trying to use more automated measuring systems, such as the Cytobot, in order to be able to identify and provide alerts a lot faster than collecting a water sample and counting it under a microscope after 3 weeks, when such a warning may not be particularly useful. The project that I'm involved in has to do with the co-production of knowledge. And again, I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes just talking about it. It is nothing new, or it's not something that you have heard of, that you have not heard of. This is essentially how we actually work when we do collaborative work. Except in this particular case, it is bringing together indigenous knowledge and generating new knowledge by combining that with a hypothesis-driven science using instrumentation, advanced instrumentation, in order to actually understand and explain how the system works. I say advanced instrumentation. I want to be sort of just, again, a little careful here in pointing out that no matter how advanced your instrumentation is, you're basically combining that with generations of observations. And so they all have their advantages. The idea here is that, if you just do one, you're not going to, if you use only indigenous knowledge, or if you only use ship-based science that is being done now, you're not going to understand and explain the system, and you need to be able to use both. There is a vast differential in power, and therefore equity in the relationship, bringing to people with different experience to basically look at the system as a whole, are all major advantages of doing co-production of knowledge. One of the terms that I like a lot in this matter is this concept of two-eyed seeing, where you have one eye that's looking at the system using indigenous knowledge, and knowing in the other eye that is basically looking at the system using new instrumentation, and then using both to understand how it all works. I really like this way of thinking because this is essentially what I've found with working with my colleagues in Alaska. And for me, reciprocity is a very important way of thinking about this, because it basically is the way of having mutual respect for the contributions from the different systems. And when I do my work, I'm always trying to figure out what am I getting and what am I giving back. The folks, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has actually come up with a series of principles, if you will, on how to do this. And a really obvious principle is nothing about us without us. In other words, if you're doing research out there, you have to engage the local communities. You have to recognize the indigenous knowledge is something that is valid in its own and doesn't necessarily need to be validated by Western knowledge. They both are two independent knowledge systems. You have to communicate your findings, and you have to do it in a way that is accessible to the people that live there. The whole thing is built on trust and meaningful partnerships. And this basically means that you share your findings and consult with the folks that live there in terms of what you do with it. The Inuit representation, that is the fact that they are part of the project, is really an important part of the idea of co-production of knowledge. So going back to it, the really, I think, good thing to take away from that is that indigenous knowledge is often place-based. In other words, you have people who live in a specific place and who have been there for a long time and have been observing the system for a very long time. And therefore, there's a long time history in terms of indigenous knowledge. Conventional science, if you want to call it that, is shallow in time, in the sense, just to give you an example, our knowledge of the Arctic right now, in terms of the kind of research that I do, mostly comes from making one trip, maybe 2 trips a year in the summer, mostly, because that's when ships can go in, making 25 measurements or whatever, and saying this is basically how the system works. While it covers a large area, so you can essentially talk about pan-Arctic systems, it is very shallow in time. And so it is really the combination of the two that allows us to get a much better idea of the system. This is a figure and a slide from Carolina Behe, one of the authors of the Indigenous co-production book, where she makes the case that for the folks that live there, they see this system as a whole. They see the polar bears, they see the walruses, they see the whales, they see the people that live there and harvest various foods there, but they see it as a whole. Whereas the conventional science we do, we're all experts. So you have a polar bear expert, you have a whale expert, you have a walrus expert, and we are very deep in a very narrow sliver of the system. And to really understand it, we need to be able to do both. We need to have the deep expertise that conventional science often offers, but we also need to be able to pull back and look at the system as a whole. Ross Schaefer, whom I'll show later, often tells a story of how you had a bunch of researchers that came there to understand how the whitefish migration patterns were changing. The whitefish were basically moving, and they came there to research that. And they met with the elders and were asking them questions as to what they had observed in the water and how it all works. And the elders kept talking about beavers. And at some point, the whitefish researcher, the lead, basically got a little exasperated, and he said, "We are asking you questions about whitefish, and you keep talking to us about beavers. What's with that?" And then the indigenous elder basically explained that the whitefish that basically swim up the rivers, some of that had changed because the beavers were building dams and were not allowing the whitefish to swim up many of the rivers to feed. So the whitefish were basically migrating in a way where they could find the rivers that were not dammed by beavers. And the point that the elder was making was that if you don't understand how beaver populations work, you won't be able to explain how the whitefish work. And if you don't understand how the whitefish work, then you won't know what's happening to the belugas that eat the whitefish. So the take home there was just that you really need to understand the system as a whole to be able to explain the behavior of the one thing that you're trying to study, which is sort of antithetical to the training that I have, which is, to really dig deep into the one thing that I know. So for me, this whole thing has been a really interesting experience in talking to people there and working with the people there. We have elder advisory councils because they are both knowledge holders, but they also help transmit new knowledge into the communities. They're also communicators. So working with elders is a really, really big part of what we do. And so, yeah, this is the story of Ross Schaefer talking about why the people that came to study whitefish basically had to learn about beavers. The project that I'm working on there is now trying to establish a community-based observatory for phytoplankton to understand how the base of the food web is changing. And so here's a bigger map of the region that we work in. So like I said, Kotzebue Sound that you see here and the Chukchi Sea is essentially just north of the Bering Straits. If you do a hard right, you basically fall into Kotzebue Sound. And the native village of Kotzebue is at the tip of the Baldwin Peninsula right about there. And it is, as you can see, completely surrounded by water. And therefore, marine or aquatic resources are very important to this community and all the communities that live around here. You have 3 major rivers that empty into this area. You have the Noatak River that is coming down there. You have the Kobuk River, and there's the Kobuk River Delta that empties into Kobuk Lake, and then it comes through this pinch point here. And further to the east and to the south, you have the Selawik River that comes through Selawik Lake and the Hotham Inlet and goes through this pinch point here. So Kotzebue is actually positioned really well to catch the sort of integrated change of waters that is going through this system here. And for me, working with this community helps us actually understand not just what's going on here, but because these are major rivers with large drainage basins, we also understand what's going on in the drainage basin because changes to, say, thawing of the permafrost is going to change the nutrient supply that's coming into the system, which will then affect the phytoplankton and then the rest of the food web. So in that sense, this is a really good system that we can work with. And I started my project there based on this observation that was for the first time seen in about 2008, where they found these green slicks of water coming up near Kotzebue and washed up on the beaches just north of Kotzebue. When it was first reported to Alex Whiting, my colleague, who's the environmental director for the native village of Kotzebue, it was first thought it was some sort of a paint spill because of this very bright green color and the fact that people don't normally see something like this in the water. They didn't know what it was, and they took water samples. They first basically were looking for pollutants, which they didn't find. But later, they took the water samples and found that actually it was made up of algae, phytoplankton, specifically cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are a challenge, not because, again, like I said, you die the next day, but the cyanotoxins actually have impact on your liver function. But they also are harmful because even if they're not toxic, they're harmful because they change the nature of the food web and they can cause hypoxia. I think, at least for those of you who have heard me talk about this before, you might know the notion of hypoxia that forms the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, where you have decaying phytoplankton that fall in the water column. And when they hit the seafloor, they're eaten by bacteria that respire, depleting the waters of oxygen. And that then kills fish and whatever else is around that need the oxygen. So the fact that you have major cyanobacteria blooms can cause really serious problems. And I think someone said they're from Florida. So just as a call out there, Florida has a major cyanobacteria problem in many of the lakes and in the coastal waterways around there. Lake Okeechobee and Indian River Lagoon both have pretty high problems with cyanobacterial blooms. In any case, these are harmful algal blooms because of what they do. And in some fashion, I don't know if I can call it good news, but the fact is that you can actually see them quite distinctly in satellite imagery. So here is a satellite, what we call a true color satellite image. It's essentially, approximately like what it might look like if you looked out of the window of an airplane, where you have Kobuk Lake and Hotham Inlet out here. And these features that you can see here, I don't know how clearly you can see it on your monitors, but these features that you can see here are surface blooms of cyanobacteria. We have algorithms, mathematical manipulation of the data that allows us to really enhance, to look at much more quantitatively in the same satellite image, and we can map these surface blooms of cyanobacteria using satellite remote sensing, which is something that I do. If you were to go out on a boat and look over the side, you'll basically see, again, I don't know how well you can see it on your monitors, but you see these lines, these faint lines in the water. Those are basically surface blooms of cyanobacteria. This is essentially what is noticed by the satellite. If you were to look at it under a microscope, this is basically what you might see, where each one of these is a cell, but then you have these long chains of these cells of this organism, Dolichospermum, which is a cyanobacteria that contains toxins. So we have set up now a community-based sampling system. So in this image, you can see the village of Kotzebue. And if you can see this, that line that you see there is actually the runway to the airport runway there. And we have a series of sampling locations where water samples are taken in the channel, in the lagoon, as well as in these places. And we analyze the water samples for the environmental parameters that I'll show in a couple of minutes. But this is essentially to understand the system as a whole and understand when these cyanobacteria blooms are happening and where they're happening. Now, a lot of the cyanobacteria blooms, and again, in this image, you can see some of these features out here, are not happening where we are doing the sampling. And there is a little element of some of the criticisms we have gotten when we wrote the proposal was that we are looking for the key under the lamppost. It's really not a particularly fair criticism, only because this is a really important pinch point for all the water that flows out of here. And therefore, by sampling in these waters, we are actually getting a pretty good idea of what's happening here in a very integrated sort of a way, without having to run around all over here trying to find individual stations to sample out of. And so we are doing, we take water samples, and one of the things we do is to actually count the numbers of cells of the different organisms. And so here's an example, and I'll show you pictures of some of these organisms that we find there. But the reason that I'm showing you this is that when we wrote our proposals, we were criticized, and it took 4 attempts before this project got funded because of widely held dogma that cyanobacteria don't happen in the Arctic, which is clearly not true. And it is one of those funny things, it's like you're writing a proposal based on people's observations and concerns, and you have people, experts like me, sitting, I don't know, New York, and telling me that, no, these things don't happen there. Just flying in the face of all the evidence that has been presented. And then there's this idea that it doesn't happen when it's cold. And we found cyanobacteria blooms happening right as ice was forming. So a lot of the dogma that is there is based on our knowledge of, studying maybe something in Florida or something like that and saying that's the only place where it happens, and not taking into account that actually climate change is happening and the systems that we think we know don't really work the way we used to think they did. So in this co-production of knowledge project, apart from sampling those locations, the other thing that we do is I go out there in the end of June or early July after the ice is completely broken up to deploy mooring, which is left out there for the entire duration of the summer. This is an instrumented mooring that basically makes measurements of various things in the water every 10 minutes. So we have a very high resolution a picture of how the system is changing in this region over time. And with that, like I said, it makes measurements every 10 minutes. So we basically can get a measure of the system over the entire summer. In this case, we deployed the mooring on the 23rd of June, and we pulled it out on the 23rd of September. And what we're seeing here is this high resolution set of measurements. I just want to show you this because apart from the fact that you have these very rapid changes in temperature. So these are various things that are, the water is changing as the water goes by. The instruments are showing these very high rapid changes. You'll also notice there are these really big spikes in the salinity, that is the salt content of the water. These are evidences of the fact that water from the Chukchi Sea is coming into the system several times a year. When we made these measurements in 22, this was novel, brand new, because nobody had ever said that they could see salt water at the surface as far inland as Kobuk Lake, which is where the mooring is. So this is really new, and this is also a great concern because the Alexandrium blooms that I talked about before, the really toxic ones where 1 or 2 cells can impact you, are found only in salty waters and offshore in the Chukchi Sea. And there was some sense that folks in Kotzebue or inland do not need to worry about it because you don't get salt water coming in there. But these measurements basically pointed out that no, that's not true. You can actually have incursions of salt water that come as, go past Kotzebue several times a year during the summer. And the other thing is that you basically can see that there are these saltwater intrusions, but you also see changes in cyanobacteria blooms after each one of those incursions, where the saltwater, when it goes out, it pulls out fresh water with it. And when it pulls out the fresh water, you're basically bringing in the cyanobacteria that happen in the lakes and bringing it out. So this is one of the mechanisms by which the cyanobacteria that actually are blooming deep in the much further interior get pulled out and into the waters around Kotzebue. These back and forth sloshing of water. Just also wanted to say that this particular spike that you see here in September was when Typhoon Marbek went literally over the mooring, and the entire mooring got sucked underwater by several meters. They had, I don't know if at that point you might have seen in 22 some pictures from the flooding in Nome, where entire houses basically were floated off their foundation and going down the river, and one of them got actually stuck, and the entire house got stuck under a bridge because it got stuck under a bridge. But anyways, I was happy to say that my mooring at least survived the typhoon, and we got the data back. Now we have done these measurements over 3 years, 22, 23, and this year 24. And you can also see that the system is very, very variable in the interannual mode. In other words, in 22, we saw, the first year we put it, we saw all these spikes. And if we hadn't put this out there, we would think that these high salinity spikes were common in the region. However, in 22, we only found really 1 or 2 spikes. And in 23, and in 24, we didn't find any at all. One thing that has happened in Alaska is that it has gotten wetter and with more rainfall over the last couple of years. And so we are just getting much more fresh water going out, which potentially is stopping the saltwater from coming in. And these are sort of the systematic changes in the Arctic that we're trying to document in this project. And we were trying to also figure out, the cause for these high salinity spikes. And so I have a student here working on trying to understand how much water is coming out of the rivers and how else these spikes are affecting the system as a whole. And so this is sort of ongoing research that we are trying to get done. But one thing you can see is that between 22 and 23, the river discharge is pretty high. And the only salinity spike that we saw was at a minimum discharge time. But once the river discharge picked up later in the summer, basically we had no more Chukchi seawater coming in. I just thought I'll show some pictures of some of the organisms that we see there. So Thalassanema and Skeletonema are two diatom species, and this is essentially what you think of as the donuts. These are the diatoms that the organisms out there, such as the Calanus pacificus, which is a copepod. It eats these things, and then this gets eaten by fish. So these, if you will, are the good guys. The Alexandrium catenella is the really toxic cyanobacteria, and a couple of cells of this will basically kill you. Aphanizomen and Dolichospermum are the cyanobacteria, which cause harmful algal blooms, but are not toxic at the same level. Like I said, we basically were using satellite data to analyze the cyanobacteria blooms, and we have developed these algorithms that allow us to actually quantify the area covered by these blooms, and then we basically can sort of look at how the number of satellite images with the blooms and quantify how the blooms are growing. So in this particular case, we are looking at how much impact the wind speed and wind direction has on the formation of these blooms. And we also are able to quantify the change in the bloom amount over time. And you can see that there is a large variability in terms of intraannual variability, but in general, there's an overall increase in the amount of cyanobacteria blooms that is happening in this area. So this is something that the community is concerned about, and we are basically providing this information to the community. We are in the process of setting up a website that actually provides the counts of the various different phytoplankton. And for us, working with the community is really important because the questions that they ask sometimes are not the questions I would think of asking, and yet are probably more profound than the questions I would ask. So for me, talking to the elders and getting their input in the project is a key part of how I work. And I almost always end up going to the schools there and talking to the students in the classroom and doing interview. The radio is an important way information is shared in the community. And so I almost always try and make a point of going to the radio station and talking to someone there, and we do some sort of an interview about the project. We are also thinking, we haven't done it yet, and this is a newsletter from a previous project where I'd worked on there, but we also are planning to produce newsletters that we leave in everyone's mailbox. So there's actually a printed copy of the findings of the project that is explained in easy to understand terms, and that is left in the mailbox of everyone who has a mailbox in the post office, which is basically everybody who lives there, because that's how you get the mail in Kotzebue. And in terms of schools, it might be of interest to you that there's a program called ANSEP, which is the Alaska Native Science Engineering Program. I was actually hoping that the teacher and the students from the program will be online today, but I do not see her, so I assume she didn't make it. It is 7 o'clock in the morning, and 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning is asking a lot. So I'm not too disappointed in that sense. But there is a student in the ANSEP program who's a part of this project and who's making weekly observations of the waters in front of her school, as well as in front of her house. And she's getting trained on using instruments to make these measurements for her to tell her classmates and her aunts and uncles about what is happening in the waters around them. And I hope to be able to capture the way she talks about it as a way for me to communicate, because I have a lot to learn from the students in terms of how you tell some of these stories. So the main thing about this project is that we are going and doing these cell counts without a more specific purpose than trying to document how the system is changing. However, there are things that happen there. For example, there was a massive herring mortality event where thousands and thousands of herring washed up on the shore. Herring is a very important food source for this community. And the question that folks wanted to know were asking Alex, the environmental director, is that herring safe to eat? Because they'd seen all these news articles about toxic algae and how they can kill you and all the rest of that. And so while normally, if they found herring washing up on the beach, they would probably collect them and eat them. In this particular case, there was a lot of questions about that. And it's not just for human consumption, it's also a lot of the herring that they collect this way is used to feed the dogs. So this is an important food source that was basically left on the beach because we did not know what killed the herring. And it is my hope that with the kind of project that we are doing now, where we are doing these observations and actually trying to understand the phytoplankton in the water, we will be actually able to answer some of these questions as to what killed the herring. In this particular case, we actually did fish pathology of the dead herring to see what actually was in there. And we found that in the gills, there were these structures which are essentially fistules. These are basically the silica-based extracellular or the cell casing that diatoms make. And so one of the hypotheses we have is, so this is a picture of a diatom, and these sort of almost needle-like structures are basically glass tubes, if you will, glass spines. And the idea was that, if there had been a bloom of these diatoms in the fall, and the fish had swum through them, then those could have damaged the gills, and that ended up causing the fish to die. It's a working hypothesis. I mean, clearly we didn't have the data in hand to actually show that that's what happened. But what we do know is that fall blooms of diatoms are starting to happen. And so this might be something that might be a recurrent feature in the future. But it is not until we do these systematic observations that we'll be able to make some sort of a definitive answer as to whether something is safe to eat or what killed something. This is a picture that one of the community members had posted on Facebook or social media. And this is basically miles-long wash up on a beach of krill. And one of the questions there was, what killed the krill? And so these kinds of things happen there. And we need to be able to answer these questions as to why these unexplained or previously unobserved phenomena are starting to happen. So here's a photograph of, you can see how extensive this krill wash-up is. The krill is a really important food source for the whales. So they understand that when something like this happens, a few years down the road, there are going to be really major effects on food that is important to them. So the community is really keen to understand what's going on, because this is not something that they can explain with their traditional knowledge. So I'll sort of wind up with a couple of quotes from the elders that I work with. Bobby Schaefer is basically the person that goes out on a boat, does a lot of the sampling with me. And he is really, really passionate and worried about how climate change is affecting their way of life. And I can say that, there is a lot of emotion attached to, I mean, when I say emotion, I mean, this is their way of life. This is how they live. But when you hear Ross Schaefer basically talk about how his knowledge is no longer useful because the system is changing under his feet, and all the traditional knowledge as to when it is safe to go out on the ice and all that is sort of changing in a way not useful anymore. Going out on the ice and ice thickness is a really major hazard there, because ice is thinner now and it basically breaks up earlier. So folks that basically go on snow machines to their camp, and they always have done that, no longer can do that at certain times. And there have been many fatalities of people falling through the ice in their snow machines and dying and drowning. So, for me, I really talk about how traditional knowledge can help us and how we can help the folks that hold the traditional knowledge. Then it is also important to realize that these are communities that are striving to express their own aspirations for what they want. So while for me, I found it a little confusing that on the one hand, they don't have a problem with the North Slope oil exploration in some fashion, because there are jobs associated with it. There's money that comes from it. And at the same time, they're the ones basically on the forefront of change from climate change. And for me, reconciling those two things was always a bit of a challenge. But for them, it is not a challenge. On the one hand, they ask the question, why should they have to pay for all the mistakes that are happening elsewhere? Climate change is not something they caused. And so why should they give up something just because someone else is causing the problem? Which for me is persuasive. And they also say, okay, if we basically say no oil in the Arctic, does that mean climate change is going to reverse itself in a way that helps us? If people are going to continue to drill oil elsewhere and put CO2 in the atmosphere, then it is not something that actually helps them. So these are really complex issues. And for me, I must confess that when I talk to the elders about this $1 billion, $10 billion of putting into conservation, what they want to know is how is it going to affect them? Is it mean when you do something like conservation, does it mean that they cannot hunt where they always hunted anymore because someone has said that whales or caribou or something are going to go extinct? So these are very complex things that don't have easy answers, but it's well worth sort of having conversations about. The 30 by 30 is essentially the thing that they are most concerned about. Who gets to decide what will be preserved? Who gets to decide what happens in the lands that they work in? And they keep reminding, nothing about this without us. So but they're not a part of many of these conversations. You have a billionaire who just decides, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and that's what happens. And with that, I will stop and take any questions if there are any.
Okay, everybody can unmute if you wish. We're open for questions. I want to thank Ajit for another wonderful talk. Some of those points you made at the end about it's not their fault, why should they suffer, lead to some very interesting discussions, or can lead to interesting discussions in the classroom and elsewhere. We've recorded this so the students up in Kosovo can at least see the recording when we have it posted.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thanks, Chris, for recording and posting. We'll send a message out when it's posted, but it'll go onto the Earth2Class page with the other presentations that we've recorded. Any questions? Renee, how can you be without questions? Okay, well, if we don't have any further questions, I guess it's time for me to get back to my tourism in Brazil.